So good afternoon and good morning to those that are following us from the US. A very warm welcome to this policy dialogue. I'll wait just 30 more seconds to give everyone the chance to join. Okay, I see that more people are joining. So again, good afternoon. And again, good morning to our US participants. So my name is Silvia Carter, and I'm a policy analyst working with the European Policy Center's European Migration and Diversity Program. I am very happy to be moderating today's online policy dialogue, where we look at EU-US cooperation on climate change, migration, and displacement. I would first of all like to use this opportunity to thank our partners, the US mission to the European Union, for their really excellent support for this event. And I would also like to note that today I'm replacing my colleague Elena Hahn, who is feeling unwell, unfortunately. But of course, most of the credits for the organization of this event go to her. So before we start, a brief outline of the discussion today. At the moment, of course, the crisis in Ukraine is on everyone's mind, but it remains very important to continue discussing other global issues that affect us all. For example, the climate crisis. So climate has received a lot of attention at COP26 last November, but also in the recent IPCC's report, looking at impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Then and now, it is clear that climate-induced migration and displacement are growing global phenomena, and they will require joint efforts with attention to the short as well as to the long-term solutions. So the EU and the US have a very important role to play, both in driving policy and action in this field. And this has also been discussed at a recent US-EU migration platform meeting. So it is worth exploring what these efforts can and should look like, especially in the future. And we will do so in today's event. But before starting, I would also like to point to several challenges that also have to be considered. So first of all, climate change and the ensuing loss of livelihoods further continue to contribute to the factors that drive people out of their homes. And I'm thinking specifically of the Sahel region as well as the Northern Triangles. Secondly, there are conflicts that are often related to climate change, in the sense that climate change itself can be a threat multiplier that adds to people's reasons to move from their homes. Thirdly, of course, climate mitigation efforts remain insufficient, and the investment in climate adaptation funds, as well as funding on loss and damage, has seen some progress. However, there is much room to grow. And one last point, there is the issue of legal pathways and the legal framework, which are currently insufficient to meet the expected needs. So it is really worth considering how the existing as well as new challenge can be used to cover these needs. So both the EU and the United States have taken steps to address these issues, but both sides still are faced with many challenges. And they also need to live up to their commitments, both vis-a-vis the international community at large, but especially vis-a-vis vulnerable populations. So against this background, I am really pleased to welcome our excellent set of speakers and to hear more about their views on the EU's and the US's action on climate change and migration so far. So I'm very pleased, first of all, to welcome back Marta, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, and who we had already the pleasure of welcoming at an EPC event last year. And then we also have here with us today Francesco Luciani, who is head of unit who is working on migration and forced displacement at DG INTPA, so international partnerships at the European Commission. Then we have Ober, who is senior advocate and program manager of the climate displacement program at Refugees International. And then Kiera Finke, who is head of the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations. So thanks to all for making the time to join us today. Before we begin with the panel discussion, I would like just to make a few housekeeping remarks. So first of all, I will give the floor to the panelists for 7 minutes each, and then we will dedicate the rest of the time to a Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, I would please ask you to submit them in writing by using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So if you could keep them as concise as possible, we would be most grateful. And please start raising questions as early as possible so that the speakers can already have a look and we can also do a better moderation afterwards. So one really last thing, this event is recorded and it will be available online on the EPC's YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'd like now to hand over to the first speaker. So Marta Youth, as I just said, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration. And Marta, we're really delighted to have you here today. I'm really looking forward for you to share what the US has been doing to address the impacts of climate change and migration and what space there is to strengthen transatlantic cooperation around this issue. So you have around 7 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Silvia, and thank you so much for inviting the State Department back. This is a great opportunity to discuss the climate crisis, forced displacement, and migration. To start, the primary effects of the climate crisis are stark, increasingly drive mass displacement. It is every day increasingly evident that climate change is exacerbating existing social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities and can really undermine food, water, and economic security. And you outlined some of that in your opening remarks. The secondary effects of climate change are equally corrosive. They're spurring displacement, threatening livelihoods of entire communities, weakening governments, and in some cases resulting in political instability and conflict. The World Bank's Groundswell report, and I cannot mention it without nodding my head to Kaylee, the author, so we're very fortunate to have her here with us. And that report notes that that climate impacts could displace 216 million people within their countries by 2050. These potential movements spotlight just how crucial it is that we act now. As an acknowledgement to this urgency, President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement on his first day in office. He ordered action to address climate change at home. He put the climate crisis at the center of US foreign policy and national security. The White House released the report on the impact of climate change on migration last fall. And this report is really serving as our roadmap moving forward. It is helping guide US government multilateral engagements that target the nexus of the climate crisis, as well as formulation of policy responses. Furthermore, in December of 2021, in case you missed it, we did it December 17th when everybody was out Christmas shopping. So I think there was a bit of, folks did miss it, but we did release our statement announcing our support for the vision of the Global Compact on Migration, which it was a reversal of our previous policy. So, and we are active in the International Migration Review Forum, and we will be in New York in May, and we hope to see many of you there. And we'll address also, obviously, climate issues at that forum. Our whole of government effort really is driving policy and program efforts today and in coming years, efforts that we believe have the potential to have a profound effect on climate-induced forced migration and displacement. And while in the United States we're viewing this as a whole of government effort, we know this is a collective effort, a global effort. And so we're working to renew our strong alliances to work collaboratively on this effort around the world, and we're cooperating with our global partners to strengthen our climate ambition. Consistent with Objective 2 of the GCM, the Biden administration has redoubled efforts to minimize the adverse drivers that push people to leave their countries of origin, and these drivers are many: violence, economic insecurity, lack of opportunity, to name a few. And the impact of climate change is really interwoven with all of these drivers. Collectively, we have to do more to support migration mitigation and to support mitigation and the adaptation of communities that are impacted by climate events. And we're taking actions to match our dialogue. At COP26 last year, President Biden announced his emergency plan for adaptation and resilience, better known as PREPARE, to help more than 500 million people worldwide adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change by 2030. We will continue to support trusted partners as they scale up support and strengthen resilience to communities at risk. Specifically, in the State Department, Bureau of Population and Refugees and Migration, through our work with IOM, we fund programs that help governments take leadership on mitigation and adaptation. We fund training for government officials on migration and climate change, as well as capacity building programs that take a proactive approach in supporting regional, national, and local coordination mechanisms that prepare for and respond to climate change. Unfortunately, it is a fact that not all individuals will be able to thrive in their home communities, even with robust adaptation support. In line with Objective 5 of the GCM, the United States really seeks to respond to displacement through safe, regular migration pathways and through strengthening access to assistance and protection for people displaced by impacts of climate change, both across borders and within their own countries of origin. Although displacement as a result of climate change is not a basis for a claim of protection under the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol, or US law even, we see that people fleeing their countries in the context of adverse effects of climate change and disasters may in some cases have valid claims for refugee status. In particular, we are exploring various protection options and policy tools, such as whether reforms to temporary protective status could be done to help bolster protection. Finally, we must work collectively and collaboratively. No one nation, no one international body exclusively holds the answer to the impacts of climate change. We remain committed to working with member states, civil society, and our international partners to find opportunities to face these climate challenges together in ways that are safe, orderly, and humane. Thank you, Silvia.
Thanks, Marta, and thanks also for perfectly keeping the time. And it was really interesting to hear this first US perspective, so that we can now move to the EU side with Francesco Luciani, who is the head of the unit working on migration and forced displacement at DG INTPA in the European Commission. So Francesco, I'm likewise very pleased that you were able to join us today, and you do have extensive experience on the EU migration policy, but particularly on the external dimension. So we would be really happy to hear how the EU is currently addressing this issue, also through its international engagement. And the floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Many thanks, Silvia, and good afternoon to everyone. You started the presentation by referring to the Ukrainian crisis, and indeed I cannot avoid starting myself from that point and reminding that the European Union is deeply committed to address forced displacement in all forms, and first of all, indeed, by offering asylum and assistance to those that are fleeing, and also to the countries that are host the refugees. And of course, I mean, not just in the courtyard of Europe, but at global level, because it's a way also my statement today to confirm that indeed the attention remains open to all the theaters, from Venezuela crisis to Rohingya crisis in Africa and across other continents. But indeed, I mean, today we are speaking about a different form of displacement, and I would like to stress that we're ready and already active in addressing also this form of this new challenge. It's a challenge that is of a size that is really impressive. I will not mention any figure. By the way, we are surrounded by among persons that are among the best experts in circulation on these topics. I just indeed can notice that the number of persons displaced by various forms, I mean, from natural disaster, sudden disaster, up to climate change or environmental degradation, is really expected to grow and to be much larger than the one displaced by wars or political or individual persecutions. So it's something that we really need to take in our hands and to address well in advance. what can we do? What do we want to do? I mean, on short term, I would say, and this is a little bit what we are really doing. The first response is to offer humanitarian assistance to those that are fleeing from natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, and any form of in sudden natural crisis. This is we are already doing. We are extremely engaged. We have the European Commission Humanitarian Office that, together with the civil protection mechanism of the member states, is at the forefront of already providing assistance in any continent whenever it happens. But of course, we have to speak about something on a different level or different structure, the climate change, which indeed implies a number of other responses. The first response, obviously, is the response that at political level we give as Europe towards the very fact itself. So the climate change requires the brave, someone says even too ambitious choice that you made to agree to the Paris Agreement, and we welcome US joining us as of the first day of the new presidency in taking this commitment to zero emissions by 2050. So we are absolutely involved into that, thrilled, very worried about the feasibility of this, but this is a different story. And at the same time, it's important to stress that we are absolutely engaged also in deploying all this towards the third countries partners all over the world. So we have absolutely featured and characterized our external dimension of development cooperation in a way that would ensure that a very large part, a very strong focus of it will be on supporting partner countries in to move towards this green transition. So this is the Green Deal policy, as we call it. And I mean, don't want to give figures. Figures are more sometimes of declaratory nature. But I mean, there is a commitment to go up to the 35% of the total budget of our external development cooperation on climate-related spending, which is slightly less than 30 billion euros over the next 7 years. And that will be translated in an avalanche of initiatives from big to small in all over the continents, in some cases extremely ambitious. Africa's Great Green Wall, up to the strategic corridors for the EU-Africa connectivity, and plenty of other initiatives. But this is indeed, let's say, on climate change in general. Of course, we need to do more and more focus on the displacement that is generated by the increasing difficult environment conditions that are affecting a number of populations, particularly the most fragile parts of them, especially in certain parts of the country. Those that are more exposed are well known. What can we do? I mean, also on that, we have no time in this first intervention to enter into details, and certainly this is matter also for more expert analysis and reflection in a tailor-made manner. But I can say in a snapshot that clearly migration and displacement, the two terms are interlinked. I mean, there is a forced dimension in displacement, but nevertheless, both are clearly adaptation strategy towards the challenges represented by climate change on the population. But nevertheless, as frequently not the best forms of response. I mean, not the preferred ones. In some cases, has also been demonstrated by some specific studies produced by some of the experts that are in this panel. I mean, in some cases, indeed, I mean, migrating is not necessarily the best option, because indeed that simply builds on the fragility. We need to do more to help the population to prevent this phenomenon, to adapt themselves slowly so as to resist, or to have those movements controlled, well managed, timely, that can allow them to continue living as they best prefer. So I'm not saying this to say something against migration, absolutely not. I mean, migration is a part of life. We are in favor, we want to manage it well, but simply saying that it must be a choice, it must be well organized, it must be done in the respect of the individual will. So we need to build a system with well partners to help the round citizens to study the challenges in advance, to understand in a tailor-made manner what's happening, to take adequate measures in advance, through training or through adequate measures. And we can work with local communities, with national authorities, with regional organizations, depending also on the interlocutors. In that respect, we also need the clearly better studies. Not that the existing studies are not bad, are not good, but we simply need the more sophisticated studies, because we have too many figures that are simply based on generic, let's say, assumption, while indeed we need studies that identify really the specific drivers that moves someone and someone else not. That's very important also to identify the specific strategies. To conclude, there is a work that we are doing and preparing that will be translated certainly in a number of projects and initiatives, but more importantly, will be translated into political initiative. As you know, as of the 1st of July, as you maybe know, as of the 1st of July this year, the European Union becomes the chair of the Platform for Disaster and Displacement. Although modest as a platform, I mean, in terms of number of participants, it's an important point to be used to spread messages, to mobilize forces and resources, and to take initiatives at global level. We intend to use it in the best possible manner. It lasts 18 months, and we are getting prepared to that. And I can just conclude, as we are speaking about the transatlantic cooperation, with an invitation to the US government to join the PDD. That was its intention to presidency ago, and we look forward to see you joining us, or in any case, cooperating with the PDD when it will be possible. And many thanks.
Many thanks to you, Francesco. And of course, hopefully we can also come back to this aspect of transatlantic cooperation later in the discussion. And before handing over to our first speaker, I would also like to take a moment to remind participants that after the panel discussion, we will move to the Q&A. So do not hesitate to keep posting your questions. And now I'll hand over to Kaylee Ober, who is Senior Advocate and Program Manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International. And Kaylee, you have worked on climate justice, the human rights of displaced people for a decade. And of course, in light of your research and advocacy work, how do you assess the US's efforts so far, and especially in relation to legal pathways and protection needs? What do you think that should be prioritized? And do you see space for further alignment between the US and the EU? Over to you, Kaylee.
Thank you, Silvia. Thanks so much for having me here. You know, as you said, I've been working on this for over a decade, and I just want to take a moment to appreciate the fact that this event is actually happening. So a decade ago, I would not have foreseen that the US would be such a vocal supporter and be so engaged on this issue. And in fact, I'm very appreciative of the fact that you know, Deputy Assistant Secretary Youth is here, and that the Biden administration is breaking ground on this issue, including acknowledging the need for safe and regular pathways and protection and assistance for those displaced by climate change. So again, if you told me 10 years ago that those words would be uttered by a representative of the United States government, I would be very, you know, I wouldn't believe you. So I'm very pleased that this is occurring. And so I'd like to reflect on sort of the Biden administration's most tangible demonstration of progress, which is the White House report on climate change and migration that Deputy Assistant Secretary Youth referred to, which I found to be very comprehensive in scope and cover a lot of ground, including on existing research and policies. However, I think the report doesn't get quite prescriptive about policy, and there's an acknowledgement that more needs to be done. And so it tasks an interagency working group to be headed by the National Security Council to grapple with these hard policy issues, including exploring climate migration and relocation within the US, assessing how climate change criteria intersects with criteria for refugee status, improving collaboration and analytics within the government, evaluating increased investments in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, and importantly for this conversation and to me as an advocate, considering legislative possibilities for development and humanitarian funding, additional protection measures, and reform of temporary protected status, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Youth noted. I think more than anything, in order to really truly have the Biden administration realize its full potential in protecting people displaced in the context of climate change, the working group has to follow through on this mandate, especially around sort of additional protection measures. You know, I think it's difficult in a variety of ways, but I'm pleased that, as I said, Deputy Assistant Secretary Youth has recognized the relevance of the Refugee Convention to some fleeing across borders in the context of climate change. I think this is in itself an accomplishment. It's also in line with UNHCR's 2020 legal considerations on regarding claims for international protection in the context of climate change and disasters. However, safe and regular pathways include more than just international protection, and in fact can be much more expansive for those who are actually impacted by climate change and displaced by climate change. Unfortunately, a lot of those pathways require legislation. And in my opinion, this is still a politically contentious issue. You know, some parts of our Congress don't believe in climate change. They actively want to prevent migration. And I believe sort of a legislative pathway forward may be a heavy lift, unfortunately. I'm hopeful that the administration will continue to consider other administrative ways forward. So Refugees International released a task force report right before the White House released its report with a number of recommendations within it that accounts for sort of administrative ways forward. We think including things such as ensuring that there is a pathway for those to be regularized that have TPS or temporary protected status already, especially if held up against a rubric of sort of long-term climate change impacts. We believe that the administration can issue sort of memorandum around this new interpretation or additional interpretation of the Refugee Convention to those who might be, you know, offering asylum or asylum officers adjudicating asylum. These are some small things that we think can make big impacts. And I think the Biden administration has some scope or room for maneuver to do that. We also believe that politics should not get in the way of potential progress. And it's not just about domestic politics. There are a number of things that can be done outside of the US Congress, and the Biden administration's foreign policy is representative of that. And in fact, the special US-EU partnership is quite illustrative of this in a variety of ways. In fact, the US and EU are often seen as leaders on this issue for a variety of reasons. And I think they can continue to collaborate moving forward in a number of ways. And I think the easiest way to join forces would be to share information and lessons learned. You know, for instance, the EU has a number of countries that offer complementary protection or other forms of protection created by national law that's different from refugee status and from subsidiary protection status, which is conferred on persons whose return is impossible or undesirable. This is practical in the case of the US in a number of ways. It can serve to modernize and expand our notion of protection by granting protection to those with a reasonable possibility that if forced to return to their country of origin, their life or physical or mental integrity would be seriously threatened due to exceptional situations such as natural or man-made disasters, including from the effects of climate change. It can also make our asylum system fairer and more efficient. For example, in 2015, Germany had a rapid influx of about 890,000 asylum seekers. And by applying complementary protection standards along with the Refugee and Human Rights Convention standards, it eliminated its backlog by September 2017. And in general, Germany has a lot to share. They recently recently released a report by the Commission on Root Causes of Displacement that featured climate change and weather-related disaster as drivers of displacement. And I imagine officials involved with that report would benefit from an exchange with those that worked on the White House report to compare and contrast findings and finding joint ways forward. I think it's important also that the EU and US underscore the importance of multilateralism. And as Deputy Assistant Secretary Youth said, this is being put into practice already, including around negotiations around the International Migration Review Forum, and in particular on its progress declaration just this week. I believe EU and US negotiators must be bold and continue to affirm some of the boldest objectives of the GCM, including noting the adverse effects of climate change as a driver of migration and committing to enhancing regular pathways for those moving in the context of disaster. Anything less would be underwhelming, especially given the renewed engagement of the Biden administration in any multilateral process. So I'm looking forward to seeing the ways in which the EU and US continue to engage on the IMRF, and hopeful that they will be progressive in nature. Thank you.
Many thanks to you, Kaylee, also for bringing forward the angle of protection and legal pathways, of course, and for drawing these relevant parallels between the EU and the US. So I'll now turn to our fourth speaker, Dr. Kiera Finke, head of the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations. So Kiera, you focus on climate adaptation, the issue of climate displacement, specifically from a security policy perspective. And inter alia, you've argued that climate action should be considered a priority in foreign policy. So we would be very happy to hear your views on the EU's efforts so far and what risks or opportunities do you see going forward. So over to you for 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. And so many has already been said. And it's of course extremely encouraging to see documents emerging from both sides of the Atlantic that really recognize migration as a form of adaptation to climate change and also as a result of climate impacts. Nevertheless, I think I'm a bit less optimistic about the actual progress that this will translate into. And this relates from my experience doing field research on the ground in Burkina Faso, in Bangladesh, in Ethiopia, other places, the Marshall Islands, on climate change and displacement. I don't see very much change over the past years on 3 key areas that are very relevant to this. So one is mitigation, and all of these were already named, but we see after this quick pause in greenhouse gas concentration increase in the atmosphere, we now see again a rise in emissions and an acceleration in the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we cannot be very optimistic about the implementation of the historical and very important Paris Agreement. The IPCC report, the latest, showed that even if we now mitigate extremely and with extreme measures, we will still see an increase of warming of at least 1.5 degrees. So there's a lot more in store for us to adapt to. That brings me to my second point, which is adaptation. Also here, it was pledged on the international level that 100 billion US dollars would be given to developing countries each year between 2020 and 2025, and we're not reaching the sum. And there's a number of countries that are not paying their fair share from the industrialized countries. So I think if we want to remain credible about helping people to stay where they are, which is, I think, one of the objectives when talking about climate change and migration, because it's also what people want, at least from my field research experience, then we also have to help people adapt where they are. And then on the third aspect is, of course, allowing migration, creating safe legal pathways. I don't really see this happening. I see it now happening in the Ukraine crisis, and this is really commendable that there's a welcoming attitude towards refugees in Europe and the US from Ukraine, but I don't see it with regards to to people who are displaced by climate change. Of course, these are the lesser numbers. Most people who are displaced by climate change move within countries and not across countries. But nevertheless, once we see increasing areas becoming uninhabitable, we have to also face the reality that people will move across boundaries. And I guess this has been acknowledged by everybody in this room. But what does it then mean? Like, what are first contingents of people? What are the numbers that people will be allowed into? How will they get here? I don't see much serious action on really allowing people to resettle into other countries on grounds of climate change impacts. And one indication of this, I think, is the situation in the Sahel. Here, the European Union, also Germany, is also putting money, for example, into the hands of the government in Niger, which are committing human rights violations against people who are trying to move. This means that people are moving in even more dangerous routes. So we're actually seeing the reverse. And it's just quite concerning what is happening there. Also, I think our policies are undermining the regional free movement agreement that are present, like the ECOWAS agreement in the Sahel. If we look at the situation on other European borders, for example, the Polish border with Belarus, Greece, Greek border, Croatia, if we see the Mediterranean, we see violent pushbacks. I was asked to comment mostly on EU policies, so this is why I'm focusing on this one. We are seeing, we have witnessed pushbacks of migrants, which are a violation of the Geneva Convention, which are a violation of the human right to asylum, to be able to ask for asylum. And we are also seeing people there who come from countries that may have been affected by climate impacts tremendously. We see incarceration of people who are migrants. We see inhumane treatment of migrants crossing borders. So this is all very concerning, I think. I now talked also a little bit about the transboundary migration, but we should also look internally when we talk about climate change and displacement. If we don't have the early warning systems in place, if we continue to rebuild in places that are extremely affected by climate change, I come from Germany. We have had massive floods in the Ahrtal. People were displaced. People died in these floods. We were not prepared. There's a lot for us actually to learn from other countries, including the US, but also including developing countries who have more advanced early warning systems than we do. So I think there's a lot to talk about. Maybe the last point to end on something positive. I think in the European Union, there's a big focus, and this has been mentioned, on strengthening the knowledge base on climate change and migration. And I think there's a huge push that has happened over the past, let's say, decade or 2 decades. We have a lot more knowledge about why people are moving, where they're moving, how different drivers of migration interlink. And one of these drivers is climate change. And I know that the European research community is really one of the world's best when it comes to climate impact science, but especially also the climate migration science. And there's a number of consortia funded by the European Union that are working on these interlinkages and may also be able to provide more detailed policy advice. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kiera, and thanks also for pointing to the positive and the less positive aspects of this conversation, of course, that are also to be remembered. So before maybe moving to the Q&A, I would also like to remind the audience that it's possible to ask questions in writing, or alternatively, please raise your hand, and I also have the possibility to unmute you in case you want to ask your questions directly to the panelists. But then to begin with, and also since I think we've touched upon some complementary yet different angles of the question, I would maybe go back to the panelists with 1 or 2 questions myself before moving to the audience, so that we can maybe also go more in depth on some of the issues that have been touched upon. And I would start by looking at the perspective of multilateralism and of cooperation by asking you to comment on the upcoming International Migration Review Forum in the framework of the Global Compact for Migration. Of course, Marta already mentioned the US renewed commitment to this fora, which is of course very welcomed. And Francesco also mentioned the EU's upcoming chairmanship in the disaster displacement platform. But do you think that these fora, these opportunities to discuss these issues are sufficient? Or do you think that we should also be searching for other coalitions, also considering the tensions between the global north and the south? And then, of course, if you have any insights about the preparation, especially looking at Marta and Francesco, would be interesting to know what is your perspective. And then especially for the speakers, Marta, Francesco, maybe also Kiera, that have commented a bit more broadly on legal pathways and on the legal framework. Let's say, where would you see the efforts and the cooperation going in the long term? And especially, could you comment on the transatlantic perspective and on responsibility sharing in particular? So hope I haven't been too long. If you need me to repeat any of the questions, I'm also happy to do so. And I would welcome comments from all the speakers, starting from Marta. I would ask you to be, of course, as concise as possible so that we can then have some time also for the Q&A with the audience. So over to you, Marta. Many thanks.
Thanks so much, Silvia. That was a lot of questions. So I don't know that I've got them all, but I will. But I guess I'll kind of loop in a little bit of reaction to subsequent comments after I spoke. Well, definitely, you know, as I said in the opening remarks, this is, you know, in the United States, we're focusing whole of government, right? Not just, you know, USAID or just the State Department or just whoever. But really, this is one of those things that is, you know, whole of world. This is global. This is not something that, you know, one government or one set of government or one multilateral organization can focus on and everybody else can just kind of go about their regular lives. I mean, this is something that, you know, as a global effort, we need to focus. And therefore, I think I have a lot of hopes and ambitions that in the upcoming IMRF meetings this will really be addressed in a very thoughtful way. I was in New York in January for kind of the opening, the beginning of this, and met with a lot of my counterparts and as well as the Secretariat of the IMRF. As well as the Mayor's Migration Council, who looked at the groundswell report and really looked at the Western Hemisphere and how internal displacement first will, based on the findings of groundswell, how it will look in the Western Hem, which was very interesting. So I think that there has been, you know, a lot of more thoughtful discussion amongst governments on these issues. And, you know, I will say that, you know, and Kaylee was very gentle. So I know that there had been criticism of the White House report in the sense that there had been hopes that it would be very prescriptive and ambitious in that way. Given that this is something that we are still grappling with as a government, really trying to figure our way forward, we really use that report as an examination of the challenge, right? And an assessment of the range of policy options and the starting point for our whole of government effort. And, you know, I wish we had all been as thoughtful and you know, as engaged as Kaylee and like been like deep into the weeds in this 10 years ago, I think as a globe, we would have been in a much better position. So we are doing a little bit of catch up, but as our administration is really working now assiduously since the release of the report to plan and organize and initiate action to have a more, you know, to have this thoughtful and strategic approach. And in terms of multilateral, you know, lessons learned, working together, you know, really happy that the US-EU migration platform, we reinstated it after 5 years. I think that is a great opportunity, a place for us to kind of create conversations and work in alignment on aligned positions. I also will note that the US government is taking on the IGC chair in 2023, and we're also exploring climate change and migration topics for that as well. So I think using all of the multilateral fora that we have at our disposal, I don't know that I have any particular comment on you know, whether or not there should be a different forum pulled together specifically. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to engage on this. And just very briefly on legal pathways, just with a nod to Kaylee's mention of, you know, that you could do, you know, legal changes are difficult. Yeah, I acknowledge that there are kind of administrative measures that can be taken by governments and by our government as well in terms of acknowledging people who move because with climate change is some of the exacerbating factors or the factor. And so this is something that in this whole of government approach that, you know, we are definitely looking at what our options are, our policy options are on legal pathways as well. I hope that answers in a very roundabout way your questions.
Absolutely. And of course, also feel free to react to any of the comments from the other speakers. And with this, I'll hand over to Francesco for his short answer.
Thank you, Silvia. I will try to quickly touch upon the points you raised. First of all, on IMRF, I must say, first of all, the European Commission, speaking on behalf of the European Union is not part of the Global Compact, because this, not because we are in favor or against, but simply because it's a matter of states. So it's our member states, and as everyone knows, some of them are not in favor for various reasons. But I mean, it has been said clearly, the substance of the Global Compact is absolutely in line with what the EU thinks and does as a whole, including our member states, including the member states that don't agree, I would say. Because indeed we have this comprehensive approach on all migration matters, and we really believe that we have to act in a balanced manner. This is a little bit the limit of the forum and the review and the discussion. We are absolutely believers in the multilateral approach. That's really where the EU finds itself most comfortable. Of course, this is a space that needs to be protected, so I will not say a single word against the multilateral forum. But simply sometimes it's transformed into a kind of litigation from some participants to twist the arm to other participants on some specific points. I mean, we want let's say, the content of the spirit of the Global Compact taken as a whole. There are too many members that pretend to be great supporters that then forget completely certain parts of the Global Compact. Also the fight against migrant smuggling, the cooperation on return and admission. So everything needs to be taken. And this is also what we strive to do ourselves. We have a lot of self-criticism. We take a lot of criticism. We have a lot of internal self-criticism. We really try to work in a balanced manner. And of course, we are not perfect, but we have an intense dialectic internally and also with our public opinion, the European Parliament. So we really try to have a comprehensive approach on migration management. And our partners, even if they are critical, I think they could confirm We never conditioned the less for less approach our cooperation. We are accepting, although we blame and complain, a number of non-cooperation on areas where indeed there is no reason not to cooperate with us. So it's important to live to this comprehensive and balanced approach, and this applies for us, but also to many of our critics. In terms of legal pathways, we have resettlement programs that they can depend also on the member states. The European Union has been trying to promote and frame and support. We have most of our asylum seekers enter directly into the country because we have a neighborhood that is a little bit challenging. So the share of the person to be resettled is limited if compared with those that arrive directly. But indeed is something that we are trying to expand, including legal pathways outside and beyond the typical strictly sensu resettlement pathways. We are also experimenting new approaches. For instance, the emergency evacuation. We did it from Libya via Niger and also via Rwanda, and also trying to make the best of also offer to students. We depend a lot on member states. That's the problem. We are not a federal government like the US. So it's a continuous work of negotiation and encouragement, etc. And of course, each refugee crisis that strikes reduces the space sometimes of let's say the readiness of doing more. In terms of climate change, person displaced by climate change or the environment degradation, etc., it's not foreseen. Just to be clear, it's not foreseen by the UAP, certainly not for the refugee status, and not even by the subsidiary protection. Nevertheless, as Kaylee was reminding, I mean, we have the beauty of not being a federal government is that at least we have 27 governments that are, can do not what they want, but they can have a lot of margins. And indeed, many of our member states will simply have spaces of humanitarian form of protection, other form of protection, but also are trying also to reflect now, as we speak, it's still a minority, on form of protection specifically addressing persons that indeed are coming from this kind of situation, at least in a strengthened form of checks before returning these persons. So it's not, I cannot say it's in the process, but nevertheless, it's something that is taken into account at least. But of course, we are not yet there. Also because we need to be absolutely prudent, because this is a new area, and creating a new obligation for the member states could open wide shut doors, and this cannot be. It says it's not clearly not affordable. Also because the planet is big, and climate change is a serious challenge. And I think I will. Just if a quick reaction to Dr. Vinke's comments on Niger, maybe, and on Belarus. I mean, no, on Niger we have to. I will not neither confirm nor deny, nor comment on human rights violations. When there are violations, they must be punished. They must be prevented. So I don't know now specifically which ones we are referring to, but we have to remind you that Niger is one of the few countries stable and democratically with democratically elected institutions in the region that is now controlled by separatist groups, civil war, terrorist groups. I mean, so it's an important partner for us. We want also to support. It's one of the countries, the poorest and the most challenged in the world. And the overall Sahel region is really under the threat. It's an area deserving our attention and our support. And of course, we need to work with the national authorities. So it's just was a way to say that we are trying to do our best to stabilize a country and the region that I mean deserves all our attention. On Belarus, just one word. I mean, this has been a big smuggling operation organized by the Belarusian authorities, and indeed, Iraqi authorities have also cooperated in bringing back vulnerable people. Indeed, there is no reason. I mean, the European Union has also intervened heavily on Polish authorities, the Belarus authorities, to fix and give assistance to the person that were absolutely at risk, and stranded, still are in some cases in the forest, here by the border of Poland. So I cannot absolutely deny that this is an issue, to be fixed still today. There are some persons are still there at risk.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And I'm sure that we could have also another event just to look at these very, very complex questions of what is happening in the Sahel region as well as Belarus. And possibly we'll invite you again. We'll think of you. But just quickly going back also to the question, I don't know whether Kiera, you want to react immediately to this, but also elaborate on the other points. If not, I will go to Kaylee and then I will come to you. So if it's not an urgent reaction, maybe I will continue.
I would like to react.
To quickly react. Yeah, I may ask you just to keep, comments to 2-3 minutes maximum so that then we can get to the questions. But then Kaylee, I will move to you. And maybe one thing that I wanted to add, considering your perspective also on the question on the multilateral fora, after you, of course, have reacted, do you think that there is also enough space for research, for experts and civil society to come in, apart from, of course, institutions and states? This is a small, let's say, follow-up that I wanted to add for the two of you. And so, Kiera, over to you again, and then we'll move to the questions.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate the answers that were given. And I understand the constraints that exists. And of course, I also condemn the use of migrants as kind of strategic objects in a political fight, right? This is what was referred to. Nevertheless, the people who are in these border situations, they need protection, and I think this is something that we have to acknowledge and have to consider. And there's a number of other situations, for example, in Croatia, which also there are questionable incidences. But this is also more related to a number of migration reasons and not only to climate change. So I would like to come back on the climate change issues. And I just wanted to highlight, because we have been working on a report together with UNHCR on the Sahel region on this question of climate migration and climate change and conflicts. And it's just a more general remark that it's not only the livelihoods that we are destroying, it's also the identities that we are destroying. So the identities of a nomadic pastoralist is destroyed when the herd is lost, for example. And this is also something that has put fuel into the conflicts that are in the Sahel. But I will stop here my remarks on this and will comment a bit more on the other questions. Yes, to multilateralism, I think this is extremely important to try to move as a global community, but maybe there are things that we can move on as smaller groups of states. So maybe, for example, a partnership between European countries and the US maybe doesn't require 200 countries or 98 countries to agree, but maybe it would be a number of countries which can provide protection to those affected by climate change in a smaller group, so to say, in a kind of lighthouse alliance. On your last point on the International Migration Review Forum or multilateral forums in general, I think you have to look at the forum as it is made. For example, at the international climate negotiations, you have a lot of civil society interaction. I think also with negotiating parties, even though they are in separate venues often, but there is, I think, a lot of overlap. In the International Migration Review Forum, I would say that actual interventions from research from civil society are quite limited. I think there's room for improvement here as well.
Many thanks, Kiera. Many thanks also for keeping it short. And Kaylee, thank you so much for your patience. Over to you.
I'll keep it short as well. I agree with Kiera that we should take an approach in which we should be making alliances or partnerships in the regions. I mean, it's clear we have regional sort of implications and regional prerogatives for both the EU and say sub-Saharan Africa and the US and the Americas, right? In fact, in a few weeks will be the Summit of the Americas, in which migration, negotiating sort of different sorts of bilateral approaches to migration. I think a whole of region approach would be useful, especially because you're already seeing sort of Costa Rica, Panama, Mexico, they're already sort of receiving different sorts of asylum applications in the context of climate change. And of course, Canada should be a part of this conversation as well. And so it's more about regional responsibility sharing and what that looks like, and everyone doing their fair share. And so I think that would be important moving forward. And in regards to civil society, I would agree with Kiera as well. There's a shrinking sort of space for civil society within the IMRF process. To my mind, I think it's overly complicated and technologically difficult. So if you've ever been to the hub in which you have conversations with each other, it's very difficult to use. It's not clear where those conversations go. And there's not many civil society that are bearing witness to sort of the negotiations or being a part of the negotiations in any way. And I think we've seen that sort of burn out, and I believe the zero draft of the Progress Declaration was wholly inadequate. And also confusing. So I think it would benefit from a more sort of comprehensive civil society input and approach.
Many thanks also to you, Kaylee. And I see that we have two very good questions in the chat, and I invite speakers to also start having a look at them, because I'll get back to you in a moment. But I see that in the audience, among the different experts that are connected, we also have Jana Palander, who is one of the researchers that have wrote a report for the Finnish government looking at climate change and migration last year. So Jana, if you want to come in orally, we would be also happy to briefly hear your views on how this report has informed the Finnish policy approach, and also what other EU member states, and why not, of course, transatlantic partners could learn from it. So please, over to you for a couple of minutes, and then the questions.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. So I am one of the researchers who conducted this research on climate migration for the government of Finland. It's called Towards a Better Understanding and Management, Finland and a Global Perspective. So we were trying to provide information to the Finnish government officials, and also come up with ideas and suggestions for action as well. And so there are many issues in the report. I invite you to get familiar with it, but I can point out some issues that that we have been talking. You have been talking about them already. We wanted to point out that it's not about choosing between mitigation, adaptation, or migration. We need all of those approaches. So this is something we wanted to stress in our report. And also, of course, about migration, if we concentrate on that, especially, there's internal and international migration, as we know. So those need different tools as well to approach them. So we try to also address those issues. But we, in our report, we're also asked to concentrate on international migration, which is the difficult part in a way from the government's perspective, as we have heard. And I share, for example, Kiera's a little bit pessimistic points of view on this. I'm a legal migration scholar. So, but what we try to point out in our report that that to kind of bring out also the issue of international migration as an adaptation measure, and not only the question of international protection, which is a bit more difficult. But I'm not saying that it's not important, but we need both. We need to address both issues. But we wanted to stress that this so-called normal migration as an adaptation measure is more humane and more empowering. It takes into account the agency of the migrant better, and it allows the people to help themselves, and we should allow them to help themselves as well through migration. And we were addressing the issue of complementary pathways as well. And what could that be? So we were looking at this issue from the point of view of what Finland could do and what EU could do. But in this webinar, our theme is transatlantic cooperation. So I would actually like to ask our panelists, what could, more in concrete, what could this be? You already addressed this a little bit. Is it benchmarking? Is it cooperation? Is it cooperation in the same region, that we kind of choose the most vulnerable region? Or is it concentrating on own region nearby? And this, of course, concerns development cooperation as well, but also migration, like regional migration could be one tool, kind of adaptation measure. But yeah, here are my remarks. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you for coming in, Jana, and also for bringing forward your expert perspective. So now, of course, you've also asked your question that all the panelists are also welcome to address. And I would briefly also touch upon 2 points that have been raised by the audience. So the first question would be on the usefulness of remittances for adaptation to climate change. So whether safe and legal pathways could also generate remittances and then be used to complement adaptation funding, and how best could this be done if so? Then the second one regards the debate on loss and damage. So since financial compensation for loss and damage was ruled out so far, what do you think about our responsibility to provide legal pathways, including for employment, as an alternative to financial compensation? So here I can go in the same order again, or whether any of you has any immediate reactions, I'm also happy to switch the order. So I don't see any hands raised. So Marta, again, over to you.
Thanks so much. So remittances for adaptation to climate change, to complement funding, right? So the funding, obviously, that is being used for adaptation and mitigation, is government or civil society funding. Remittances are, individuals who are providing money or funding back to their families. Now, so this is something that is completely in their hands to decide how to utilize that funding. Now, if there is a way to help, to assist individuals who are sending remittances back to countries of origin, and to help them invest in ways that are, adapting and mitigating, I think that's well within the realm of possibility. But I think that would be incorporated into efforts really by governments and donors in terms of what is being already done on adaptation and mitigation programs. And then legal pathways, kind of as compensation for wrongs. I think that just as financial compensation was ruled out, I think it's very difficult to assess, blame and assess, who receives compensation, and a pathway, a legal pathway as compensation does not seem likely. But I will say a legal pathway as a pathway to protection, as a path, and increasing those is extremely important. And just one other thing that in the discussions that have been happening, and I know we're short on time, so I'll just make it very quick, but that I wanted to mention is, as we're talking about all of these movements of people, we haven't really talked about, and I know the researchers amongst us will probably, this is right up their alley, the data-driven part of this, in terms of where we focus resources on adaptation and mitigation efforts, where we really increase development programs that are focused on this, where we look to help affected communities. A lot of this, if we are seeing people moving because of climate, being able to tap into that data and understand why people are moving and understand from whence they came and so forth is something that I don't know that we are always we actually collect that information as governments as well as we should. And I think this is really an important factor, because if we are going to have policy responses, we're responding to, why to what we think are the drivers and where we think the drivers are coming from, but being able to have more data and understanding as people are moving, where they're coming from and why, would be really helpful in efforts focusing assistance. Over.
Many thanks, Marta. And of course, data is also something that comes up as a good field for future cooperation, potentially. And with this, I would then hand over to Francesco for his answers.
Referring directly to the two questions, I mean, in terms of the usefulness of remittances for adaptation to climate change, I think, of course, this is the reason why indeed, I mean, they are particularly relevant when indeed a part of the group, of the family, leaves, and as people left behind that need to be supported. Because in some cases, indeed, it's all the group that has to move and leave and stays together. But I mean, in many cases, indeed, I mean, this is the way that the first intermediate, probably the most common step, in which someone, a younger, the man, someone of the group leaves, and remittances can be crucial to keep on to keep the group or the family surviving, rarely expanding its wealth. I mean, so I can simply say that as European Union and together with many of our member states, we're doing our best in general to support the reduction of the cost of transfer of the remittances, and also the financial literacy in some cases, or to push and encourage and to help through also local support to make the best use of these resources for development, not for immediate consumption. But the fact is that in many cases, I mean, indeed, the resources are so limited, so scarce that I mean, they simply are enough for the survival when there are some remittances indeed, because sometimes the migrants themselves are at risk and they have challenges in surviving themselves, I mean, because they can be particularly exploited also themselves, etc. So again, yes, remittances of course are part of the adaptation, but indeed the best is to try to support the community to resist where they are, eventually with some adjustments, I would say. As regard the legal pathways, I mean, we believe they should be, in any case, not imposed on the receiving country as an obligation, because in any case, this is about creating a space for a person that is due to stay. So it should then integrate in the country, find a job. I mean, it must be a voluntary-based mechanism, not being part of an obligation system, I would say. And then, of course, I mean, it would be but I see, of course, if legal pathways, admission versus financial, yes, it's fine. I mean, it's interesting as an option, but again, not as an obligation imposed. Also because receiving countries have very different approaches and capacities also. And also the person themselves that need to be relocated or resettled or are looking for admission somewhere have a very different profiles. I mean, a young, highly skilled person can go almost everywhere. Others will have some limitation. There are preferences. Families are different from from single persons. So indeed, we should avoid the automaticities and the rigidity, but indeed we need to enrich the panoply of tools and have government structure that are able to a little bit be skilled enough and clever and smart to use different rosters, what is offered by the roster, I would say. And of course, this is not just about the north and the south of the planet. Of course, this is more complex, and indeed, many of the movements will be within the countries or in the region. Again, not because we are in favor, or it's a way that is in the money trying to prevent the EU from taking its own responsibility, but because this is also something that makes the overall operations more feasible, more realistic, and also corresponds better to expectation of many of the persons involved.
Thanks, Francesco. And before turning to Kaylee, also looking at the audience, in case you have any remaining questions, this would be the best time to post them in the Q&A box so that we can maybe take one last before ending the event. But now over to Kaylee for her answers.
Thank you, Silvia. I'd like to speak to the remittances question based on sort of field research that was conducted by a research group I was a part of for my PhD in Thailand, which was interrogating the question, when is migration and adaptation strategy, and specifically looking at remittances. Oftentimes, especially in the Thai case, remittances aren't used for sort of adaptive measures. It's used for consumption or, overcoming sudden shocks to sort of income to households back home. But this is where it's actually a policy imperative to sort of intervene to ensure that those remittances are being made of good use. And I think, Francesco mentioned reducing costs of remittance transfer, providing financial literacy, but also, doing something as simple as matching sort of remittance transfers. Mexico has done so, for instance, like a 2-to-1 match when Mexicans are remitting back home. They also invest in sort of their community where they're from. And also economists have shown that if you were to tell sort of migrants that they're remitting was being mirrored by matches to, say, education in the Philippines, this was an instance, that people tend to remit more, so 60% more. I think it's also imperative, as Francesco noted, that sort of migrants' rights, labor rights really underpin the ability for a migrant to be stable and to make enough to remit home. Not all migrants remit, because sometimes they are in a precarious situation. So it's really a policy imperative, right? And then the second question, well, actually, I wanted to speak to Deputy Assistant Secretary Youth's comment about we need more data. I agree to some extent, but I think we also fall under the tyranny of data sometimes, in which we say we need more data in order to be immobilized for action. And I think we can see that many governments make decisions without data based on sort of political ramifications or political will. In fact, the last administration did so all the time. And so I think there is an opportunity to act with or without the data, and even just hitting some of the benchmarks that Kiera mentioned, like mobilizing fair share of money for adaptation, for instance, when it comes to climate financing. So, simple things that can be done with or without data.
Thanks, Kaylee. So, and to conclude, over to Kiera for her answers as well.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add maybe another aspect to the question of remittances, and then maybe also to the other question. What I learned, and I'm sure Kaylee has also observed this in her research, is that the outcomes of migration in response to climate impacts are very diverse. So yes, we have like these success stories where people are able to adapt through migration, and they're able to live a successful life, ideally send back remittances either from an urban location within their country or from outside of their country. But I think we much more often see a condition where people, and I'm now talking specifically about people who move because of climate impacts, where people fall into poverty traps. So the first people who are moving, and of course we're just at the beginning of the climate impacts we will witness, because we have put a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. So what we are witnessing now is the movement, especially of people whose livelihoods are closely intertwined with ecosystem services. So fisher folk, subsistence farmers, etc. And so these are the first in line, and they have extensive knowledge about traditional farming, extensive knowledge about their environment, but they don't have any knowledge or skills that would match them to an urban labor market in their own country, not speaking about a labor market in a country far away where even the languages may be different. So this doesn't position them very well to be a good source for remittances. I've even spoken to a number of people who got support from the rural areas to sustain their livelihood in the urban areas, because they were so poor and they had to pay rent in slums, etc. And the conditions were very, very sobering. So I think it's, therefore, I think it's very important what was mentioned by Marta and Francesco, the support of organizations like IOM, who provide pre-departure trainings, organizations like USAID or the German Development Corporation, who help people build the skills so that they are able, if they have to move, to integrate and to build successful livelihoods, because these people don't have many options open to themselves. The last thing I wanted to say about this very, very complex question of loss and damage, and I think industrialized countries will not get around into putting more money into loss and damages. Otherwise, I think the agreements in the international climate negotiations will be at risk, at least, for a number of reasons. Because the losses are so high, because the historical responsibility, we didn't talk about much, but about responsibility, and I agree it's complicated, but no doubt European Union member states and the United States, since these are the entities we're talking today about, they are responsible for large shares of current and past emissions, and this is destroying livelihoods abroad. So I just wanted to place this once in this conversation, and I don't think this is contested knowledge. So I think in addressing responsibility only through that, in some maybe insufficient ways, we will be able to move forward globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kiera. And I see that we have almost 10 minutes left, so we can maybe use this time to ask the last question, and also to give you the opportunity maybe to make a very short closing statement, or just to highlight any key takeaway from this conversation, especially focusing maybe on what should come next in terms of EU-US cooperation on migration and climate change. But moving to the final question, it looks at, let's say, how women and children are particularly affected by climate change and how to address their needs. So the question asks, what can the US and EU partnership achieve in that sense, let's say, without getting on the wrong side of partnering actors in regions that might feel like the West might undermine their patriarchal culture or traditions? And Marta, I'll move to you. Maybe if you could keep it to 1 minute, it would be great. Many thanks.
Thanks, Silvia. And so very quickly, yes, on this question, and we see this frequently, women and children are frequently at the forefront. One of the things I do think that I just wanted to mention very briefly is when we talked about choice. I mean, a lot of, and as Francesco said, this isn't some kind of cop-out. It's not like so that we say, well, we don't have to worry about, we don't want to incentivize migration. But I think a lot of what we need to be doing is making sure that people have a choice, right? A choice to stay, and really helping lay the groundwork to so that they are able to stay if that is their choice. We're not trying to say that migration shouldn't happen, but if they want to stay, to create the conditions so that they can. And this, is not specific to women and children, but just in general. Sorry, I know the time is short, so I'm not sure I got it exactly, but.
Yeah. Any final remark on your end, Marta? If not, I'll move to Francesco.
I'll pass.
Okay, perfect. Francesco, over to you.
I try to be really telegraphic on the most important things. What can we do? What do we want to do? I mean, in a nutshell, I think what we want to do is indeed to help them, as Marta was saying, having the possibility to have a choice. And in that respect, for us, it's important to connect a little bit the dots between the studies that and the collection of data that we want to further support, and indeed the reality on the ground. We understand that in several cases it's possible indeed to prevent, to mitigate, to take measures, to get trained in advance, to get reinforced on certain things, to elaborate strategies of adaptation. We wanted to have this connection in the countries that are more at risk between indeed those that are in the front line, so that's the most fragile part of the population, and those that can help with knowledge, with capacity of monitoring, with also the capacity to suggest solutions. As in some cases, a technical solution, in other cases, requires political choices. So we need to connect these two levels and arm them with the capacity indeed to cooperate. It depends on us. Of course, it will depend very much also on the authorities of the partner countries, but we are very much convinced that by discussing, we will mobilize resources, and many people are really, organizations are really to work on this endeavor.
Thanks, Francesco, and over to Kaylee.
Thank you. I just want to touch briefly on the question at hand, and I apologize, there's construction happening right outside my house exactly at this moment, of course. But I think it's more about than just women and children. It's about all sorts of intersectionalities that may exacerbate vulnerability. So, for instance, a rich white woman in the US would face far less sort of shocks to her income in the face of climate change than, you know, a poor, maybe disabled indigenous woman in Central America, right? Who's more reliant perhaps on agriculture for her livelihood. So we have to think about those multiple layers when we're talking about sort of vulnerability. And this is just a reminder to do so. And I think that's a good sort of segue or pivot to remind everyone in this room that this is not just sort of some theoretical discussion. This is something that's happening on the ground right now that is impacting communities and individuals on the front line. And we must be as bold and progressive as possible on this issue because it's a ticking time bomb, essentially, and it's a moral, it has a lot of moral implications. So I'm hoping that, you know, the US and the EU really join together and really move the needle on this issue.
Many thanks for pointing this out, Kaylee, and then Kiera for your concluding remarks.
Thank you. Yes, I think my comment would have gone in a similar direction as Kaylee's comment. Maybe just to add, of course, to group women and children together, I think it's already maybe not doing the whole thing justice. Of course, there are very distinct groups, and then there are very distinct groups among these two categories. But nevertheless, I think here, I think classical development work is asked for that focuses on enabling people through opportunities of education, of skills training. I think this is very important to strengthen both children and also women who often don't have these opportunities. Maybe just a final statement, because we talked about a number of different crises today. First and foremost, of course, the climate change and migration nexus, but also we touched upon Ukraine and other issues. I think it's so important for our empathy not to be used up, but for it to be self-sustaining. And I think this is very hard to achieve, but we shouldn't look at it as a cake that when one crisis takes away a piece and that it's getting less and less and we're left with nothing in the end. Especially in these times, it's important to remind ourselves that there are other issues that need to be resolved beyond those that call for our immediate attention. Thank you.
Many thanks to you too, Kiera. And with this, I think that we can wrap up this webinar, and we can certainly take away the fact that there is a lot of consensus about the urgency and the importance of tackling these issues, but also a new awareness at the institutional level, which now, of course, will need to be taken forward, also breaking a bit the silos approach that we'll often see when looking at climate change and migration. So hopefully the upcoming fora will also be a good opportunity for progressive transatlantic cooperation. And with this, I thank once again all of our panelists for their excellent contributions and engagement throughout the discussion. And thanks again to our partners at the United States mission to the European Union, as well as to my colleagues, Elena Hahn and Kiera Finke, that contributed to the organization of this event. So thanks also to all the participants for bearing with us and for the interesting questions. Please keep following the EPC and the migration team for future events, analysis, and activities. Many thanks, and have a good rest of the day for the US participants and a good afternoon for those in the EU. Goodbye.